Let's take a look at how we can do list-based data binding in Silverlight, having looked at simple data binding in a previous video. So what I'm going to do is just go to my code that lives behind my UI. As usual, I've got an empty Silverlight project and an empty web project with the two linked together, just from doing File New Project in Visual Studio. Let's look at the code that lives behind my UI, and at the moment we've got nothing. So let's just go ahead and create some class that we're going to ultimately data bind to. It's worth saying that in Silverlight you can't bind to anonymous types, so you do need concrete types in order to data bind. So what we'll do here is just create a class. So we'll have a class. We'll call it person, and onto that class person we'll put a property for the first name, let's say string first name, and we'll put a property for the last name, and we'll put a property for the age. Let's say age, something like that. So we've got a simple class here. Notice that we should really implement change notification if we want to really do binding with this, as I showed in the previous video around more simple data binding. But here we'll get away with just having this very simple class like this. Let's write a method that creates a few of these person objects. So let's just have private static list of person. We'll call this make people, something like that. And what we'll do is we'll return a new list of person, and we'll construct that list by creating some new people. So we'll have new person, we'll have first name is Fred, last name is Smith, age is 30. We'll copy that, we'll have a couple more, we'll just have 3, we won't go too far, and we'll have let's say Bob Jones, who's 31, this guy could be 32, and he can be somebody Jackson, let's say Will Jackson, something like that. Alright, so we managed to create a method that returns some people, and we can use this as the basis for data binding. So what I'm going to do is at the point where the page loads up, let's say loaded equals on page loaded, then into this function here, what we'll do is we'll get a list box on our UI and we'll data bind it. Switch back over to the UI, and let's just move this up a little bit. So into the grid here we'll put a list box, we'll give it a name, let's say list people, something like that, and what we're going to say is that its item source, i.e. where the items come from, is bound, and I'm just going to put 2 empty quotes in there like so. So we're basically saying the items that this thing binds to are bound to a list that comes from the data context directly. So there is no property on the data context you need to index in, it's just simply binding to the data context directly. If we move back over to our code here, what we can say then is list. Well, actually there's a couple of ways of doing this. Let's just build so we get that IntelliSense. Whoops, looks like we got it wrong. Let's finish off that element. Fine. Let's build. Let's go back to our code. So we could say list people dot data context equals, and that would set sufficient data context for that list box to pick up those items. Or we could say this dot data context equals, so kind of doing it at the parent level, and this gives us control as to whether we want the data context right next to the very control that's using it, or we want it at a higher level. I guess what we'll do here is just say this dot data context equals make people. Okay, let's go build. Let's press F5. Let's say OK. Let's see what we get. Let's get rid of that notification and go to IE. Okay, cool. So we see list binding .person. Clearly this is the output of a toString method, because we haven't given the list box anything better to do than just display the output of toString. But we've got 3 entries, which looks about right, so that's a good start. Let's close that down. So the way that the list works is it's kind of a templated control, so we can go back to that list definition and we can tell this list box what to display for each of the items that it comes across whilst data binding, essentially. The way we can do that is through a thing called the item template. Now we could set this to a template that we put in line here, or we could set it to a resource. I guess we'll just put it in line here, so we'll just go ahead and say listbox.item template. This is a thing of type data template, and basically what we're saying is for each entry that you come across, this is what to display. So why don't we just go with something like a stack panel, and we'll say orientation is horizontal, and then into that what might we want to put? Well, I guess in our case all we'll do is we'll just drop out 3 text blocks. We'll have a text block, and the text is going to be And this is really where the nice thing about this control comes in. We can say the text is bound, so we can say binding to first name. And then we can copy another one, and we can bind to last name. And we can copy another one, and we can bind to age. These things will all bind quite naturally, so we don't need to worry about conversions and so on that we've looked at in other videos. Let's try building that. Let's try rerunning. And let's see what we get. Okay, so we've not got it very nicely spaced out, but you can see that we've got our values coming through. We could spend some time laying those out. I suppose we could just add margins to these things and make them look a little bit better. Let's say the margin is 5000. Same thing here. In fact, let's just copy that. Now, there's lots of things we could talk about here. We've only put text blocks in here right now, and we could use things like text boxes, and we could do two-way data binding and so on, and that's looking slightly better. And as you'll know if you watch the video I made on simple data binding, we can do property change notification. All of that stuff works here in the same way as you would expect it to work, you know, when you're not using a list. So it's really nice to find that by the time you get to the item template for a list, you're back into a very familiar world of data binding. Now, one thing you might be puzzled about is what you do about selection change and those kinds of events for the list box. How do you know how you get back to a particular bound object once you're actually working with this thing at runtime? So let's handle the selection changed event, and I'll actually let Visual Studio throw in an event handler for that. I didn't like it. Let's see if we can get Visual Studio. No, it's not going to do that. Let's say on selection changed. We'll do it ourselves, and we'll pop to the code behind here, and we'll put in an event handler for that. So we'll just have event handler selection changed, and this is going to be a selection changed event args. Now, what do you get on this selection changed event args? Well, what you get is you get args dot which items have been added to the selection and which items have been removed from the selection. So this is kind of interesting, because if we say for each, now what do you get in args dot added items? What you get is a list. So we can say for each, let's just say object O in args.added items. Let's set a breakpoint here. We'll just put a piece of code in here so we can put a breakpoint on that, and let's run. So when the selection changes, we should get an event now, hopefully. Let's go and see if we get selection changed. So let's select, and we can see that O is a person. So what's happening here is we're actually able to get very easily to a particular selected data-bound object. The object that we get back is not the list box item, it's not the UI. What we actually get back is the data-bound object. So we got list binding person in this case. So it makes it very easy for us to know which of our data objects have actually been selected at any one time. It's very simple. We can also go and look at properties like list people dot selected index, and if we wanted to use that, we could then use that to index into this array here. And we can also look at selected item, which in a single selection mode is also going to give you an object which will be one of these persons again. So it's very easy to get to the data bound object when you have a list box which is data bound. You very easily get to these things. And in fact, if you were wondering, for instance, how you might get to the UI for that object, how you might get to that stack panel, it's actually a lot more difficult than it is to get to the data bound object that's behind the list box. Now, it's doable, and there's a couple of ways of doing it, and probably the simplest way of doing it is that you could, for instance, say in your XAML here that when this element is loaded, let's say equals on item loaded or something like that, and then that's going to call you when the stack panel is created. And what we could do then is just handle that. Let's have an event handler here on item loaded, put a breakpoint in there, and we'll see that the item that comes through will be the three stack panels that we've created. So it's a pretty easy way to capture those three stack panels. Let's see if we see that. There's a stack panel number 1, there's stack panel number 2, there's stack panel number 3. There's another way of doing this, but I won't go into it here in this video. The point is that it's very easy for you to get back. Let's just clear out this loaded handler and get rid of this function. It's very easy for you when you've data bound one of these list boxes to get to the actual data bound objects, which is 99.9% of the time what you're going to want. Slightly more difficult to get to the UI representation on the screen, but that's going to be the 1% case really that you want to get to that stuff, and it's doable anyway. So hopefully you see very quickly that we can take innumerable types we can very easily bind them as the source of the items in something like a list box here. And then we use something like the data template here in order to display something custom for each item. And within that data template we get back to regular data binding, which we've seen in a previous video, for how to bind each of those particular items. And then finally, when we want to know back in our code which is the currently selected item, it's very simple. It's selected item, and that will give us an object, and in our case that will be a person object, assuming there is some selection made and it's not null. So it's very easy, very simple to data bind lists. If you're calling web services and so on, you get back a list of people. It's almost trivial really to get that kind of stuff onto the screen in a quick and easy way.